All right, guys, welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion of the juvenile justice system, which again is similar to but different from the adult court system here in the United States. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about juvenile courts and how those things go down. First off, juvenile courts, they're not called trials, they're called hearings, okay? Sometimes they're called juvenile court, sometimes they're called family court, but they're not just called a criminal court. Juvenile courts love to have different names for everything. So they can't call it a trial, it's a hearing. They can't call it a criminal thing, it's a delinquency or a family court thing, right? So there are two different kinds of offenses that juvenile courts hear. The first is status offenses, and the second is delinquent offenses. Status offenses are things that are only illegal because the person is a juvenile. Delinquent offenses are things that are illegal for everybody. The person just happens to be a juvenile, right? So status offenses could be truancy, right? Skipping school is a crime, a juvenile crime. Or, smoking cigarettes underage, or, something like that. Something that is only illegal because they're young. Delinquent offenses are, your armed robberies and your assaults and, things like that that are illegal for everybody. They just happen to be juveniles when they did it, okay? These juvenile court hearings, they're not open to the public. So many adult court cases, they're open to the public. Anybody who wants to can go sit in the audience, watch the whole thing. But these juvenile cases, they're not. There's a very big attempt to make sure that the social impact on juveniles there's no negative social impact, right? So they do their best to try to make sure that this juvenile court hearing will not impact that juvenile's life outside of the courtroom. So this is one way they do it. They're not open to the public, only kind of the family of the juvenile, the lawyers, the victims, only people that are directly involved in the case can actually be there in the hearing room. Newspapers and other media outlets, there's special rules about publishing the name of the defendant, okay? And essentially the rule is if the newspaper or the media outlet learns the name of the juvenile from an official source, i.e. law enforcement, the court system, something like that, they are not allowed to publish that name. But if they learn that name from an unofficial source, a friend of the defendant, friend of the victim, they find that name in some other way other than an official government source, then they are allowed to publish that name. Again, that is an attempt to have the situation not socially impact the person accused, but it's a compromise with the First Amendment, right? So we have a First Amendment that protects the press's right to publish things and investigate things. So that compromise is kind of trying to respect both. It's got the First Amendment part in it where they can publish what they learn outside of official sources, but it also attempts to protect the name of the juvenile through official sources. Juveniles cannot be jailed in the same facility with adults, okay? If you send a juvenile to a prison or reformatory or whatever you want to call it, they have to be physically separate from any adults, okay? The one exception to this is directly before and after a court hearing, there are many courts, like the physical buildings in the United States, where there is only one holding area. And if that physical building hosts juvenile hearings and adult criminal trials, there might be a situation in which you're forced to house juveniles and adults in the same facility because that court building only has one facility. That is the one exception to that. But outside of that, directly before or after court being held in the court building's facilities, Juveniles and adults cannot legally be in the same facility. They have to have a special one. If a juvenile is waived to adult court, that is permanent. That's not just for that one case. Okay, so let's say, I'm 14 or 15, I get waived to adult court. Either I get found not guilty or I get found guilty and serve 6 months or a year or something. I get out of prison, I'm still a juvenile. If I get caught and charged with another crime, I automatically go to adult court. There is no, I don't have to be waived again, right? So once you're waived to adult court, that follows you until you turn 18. You can't go back to juvenile court. And then once I have served my time in a juvenile reformatory or juvenile care facility, whatever you want to call it, they don't call it parole. Okay, they call it aftercare. So let's say I get out of my reformatory, I get sentenced to 2 years. After a year, I get out on aftercare, which is like parole. I have an aftercare officer who follows me and makes sure I'm going to school and doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. But again, the juvenile system hates using the same words that the adult system uses. And their theory there is, once again, that it kind of colors and stigmatizes juveniles in the way they don't want. Okay? Another thing, anytime you talk about juveniles, you have to talk about gangs. Okay? Gangs are one of the big, big, big fears when it comes to juveniles. And not coincidentally, the criminal peak in the mid-90s was also the peak in gang violence and gang membership. Okay, back in the mid-90s, there was this increasingly large problem with gangs. There was increased media focus on gangs. It was just gangs, gangs, gangs. Our kids are being, inducted into these horrible gangs, blah, 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 and everybody was freaking out about gangs. But it's interesting to ask yourself, what's the cause and what's the effect? Did gangs go down because crime started going down, or did crime going down because gang membership started going down in the mid-90s? But the definition of a gang is very, very difficult to nail down. It's like terrorism or cybercrime or any of those things. There is no one really good definition of a gang, but the most definitions have something to do with groups of people getting together for an organized criminal activity, right? Now, the classic gangs are like the Italian mafia, and they got together to do like loan sharking and gambling and prostitution and things like that. The more modern gangs, the Bloods, the Crips, the Latin Kings, the Aryan Brotherhood, they get together to commit these crimes as well, but it's more often drugs, right? They sell drugs, they import drugs, they distribute drugs, and as such, the drug selling territory is a very big deal for these modern gangs. Certain street corners are where lots of money is made, and thus gangs will commit lots of violence in order to secure that territory for their own money-making operations. That is not the only crime they commit. That is not the only reason for their existence, but that is one of the very, very big drivers of gangs in the late 20th, early 21st century. And there are kind of two kinds of gangs. There are the traditional gangs, which are, again, the Italian Mafia, the Bloods, the Crips, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Hells Angels, things like that, where their entire purpose is to commit crime, and they're in that gang 24/7, and they live as part of the gang. But then there are specialty gangs, which are things like prison gangs or school gangs, right? So there might be a gang that forms at a school where when members are at school, they are a part of this gang, but then when they go home, they don't participate in gang culture while at home. Okay, so it's kind of a school-only thing, similar to prisons. You know, there might be a prison gang where once you get out of prison, you're no longer a member because it only exists within the prison. And then there are kind of hybrid gangs, which are kind of weird gangs that don't really meet the definitions of the traditionals or the specialties, but you can read up on gangs if you really want to know more. The last thing I'm going to talk about for this subsection is schools and school violence. Okay, whenever you're talking about juveniles, you got to talk about schools and school violence because those are things that we are very, very, very worried about as a society right now. In fact, I was in high school when Columbine happened. I remember kind of the response, both through the media and through the school system, and parents and my friends' parents and all these things. And it was a very, very big deal. People started really being scared about the safety of students. And then many years later was the Newtown shooting, where I think it was 26 students and staff at an elementary school in Connecticut were killed by a mass shooter. But those are very, very important problems. Mass shootings in general, or mass shootings at schools especially, we're very worried about our children, and we should be, because our children are an especially vulnerable portion of our population. It is natural to want to protect children. It's natural to want to protect them from mass shootings and also from gangs, right? There's a perception that gangs are a big deal, especially in like the larger city public schools, that violence is driven by gang membership, or bullied students are going to bring a gun to school. So what do? Well, we got to have clear or mesh backpacks, and we got to have bulletproof blankets that are available in schools, and we got to do this and we got to do that. And in reality, school is probably the safest place a child can be. A student's odds of getting shot or stabbed or killed in a school are way, way, way lower than they are basically anywhere else. Okay? If you're a parent, you should absolutely be concerned about your school's safety, your child's school safety, but put it in perspective. Your child's odds of getting hurt in a school are far lower than they are getting hurt in the other places they go, right? So don't ignore it, but give it the perspective that statistics and research shows it deserves. Does that make sense? All right. That is the end of section 14. Thank you for watching.